going to post this really quickly on the Tom Woods Elite Facebook group. Okay, we're live. Just let me make sure it's posted. Okay, yeah, I posted this to the Tom Woods Elite. I don't know if anyone's going to watch this or not live, or anyway, you can watch the rerun if you don't like it. But I am here with Andrew, and there was someone else who's going to come on, but they didn't want to, so I guess that's okay. But we're going to discuss immigration, and this is just kind of like a chill hangout. We're just kind of talking about from a libertarian perspective, because it's kind of hard to do it in the comment section where you're typing little responses and there's all these little points, and it's a very nuanced issue, very complicated, and a lot of very smart libertarians have different views on this. So we wanted to have a discussion in person. And so for those of you who are maybe from my YouTube channel or who came across this video in some other way, this is basically a debate that was formed from within the Tom Woods Elite Facebook group. And so everyone here, which is just two of us, I guess, we are paying members that we pay Tom Woods money every month, and we're in his Facebook group. It's a very great group. I highly recommend it. I've promoted it before on the channel, and so I highly recommend that anyone joins. And maybe if we do another one of these hangout debates, you could join if you then join that group. So I highly recommend it. And so here we have Andrew, and right now I have him muted because basically we had some technical issues and we can't get it. When I talk, it keeps echoing into the microphone, on his microphone, coming back. And we tried everything. We tried going on his iPad. We tried everything. We can't stop it from echoing. So we're just kind of stuck in this awkward situation where we're going to have to mute his microphone every time I talk so that the echo doesn't go through the live stream. But regardless, I think it'll be okay. It'll be a little bit more clunky, a little more awkward as a result of this dynamic of having to constantly mute and unmute him. But I think it'll be good. So Andrew, how are you doing? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm doing great.
Awesome. Oh, see, there's the echo. So I muted you again. So now let's just, I want to get what is your perspective on immigration? Now, we're both libertarians here. I assume you're an anarcho-capitalist. We can, if you're not, go ahead, let me know. Just tell me your viewpoint. What do you think? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
So I come at this from a Hoppian private property viewpoint. And so I'm really glad that you set this discussion up, because you said it best when we try to have these discussions on the group. It's extremely nuanced, and a lot of times we're talking past each other. And so that's why I said I've had these discussions at least with James Riley, and we've had some pretty productive conversations. But I think this is the best forum for us to continue this. So when I come at the immigration issue, I try to start from a private property and non-aggression principle aspect. So what I mean by that is I think that we need, before we get started, to properly frame this issue and to define our terms good. Because I think in one of your comments that you talked about the open borders versus closed borders was kind of the thing there. It's because I like to see you define what open borders is, because I think that's improperly framing the issue. And I really don't like the frame open borders, because I think it encompasses too much, and it's not a very precise term. So that's why I want you to define it, so we can so we're not talking past each other on this.
Should I do that right now?
Just let me frame it how I think we should frame it, and then you can tell me if you agree with that. So, because as a libertarian, the state can't legitimately own property. Okay, the only way that one person can properly travel from one piece of property to the other would be if there's consent involved in both parties. Okay, so when you introduce the state, you introduce all kinds of issues of aggression. So in my mind, the only libertarian position has to exist without the state, right? Immigration is an easy issue to solve if every piece of property in a given area is privately owned. It's pretty self-explanatory from that. So that's how I come at the issue. When you introduce the state, now you've got the entity that has a monopoly of force that draws the lines themselves. And so coming up with a libertarian position given a state is a difficult thing to do. And I would say I don't think there's a straight up libertarian position on immigration if the state is involved. And so I kind of take the same view that if you ever read about Bionic Mosquito's blog, that's kind of his take on it, is that when there is a state and there are state borders, we can't have a perfect libertarian position. So I think the way we should phrase this debate, okay, the way I look at this is, given the state, does excluding immigrants from entering state-owned territory violate the non-aggression principle? So if, let's say, the United States were to say to stop somebody from accessing like a public road or public lands that are border of the United States, if they were to stop somebody coming in, is that per se a violation of the non-aggression principle? I think that's the way we have to come at this to understand this, because we have to be given, if we're going to have this discussion, we have to be given a state, because if we don't have the state involved, I don't think there's much of an issue. I think if we were in an anarchist society, I think we're going to all have agreement on how immigration works. It's all going to be voluntary and consensual. It's not an issue. The issue libertarians have is, how do we deal with this given that a state exists?
Okay, let me mute you really quick. Okay, so that's a really good introduction. I really like that. Okay, so first you wanted me to define what I meant by open borders. So basically, open borders is, as I completely agree with you, the conversation of whether we have open borders or closed borders, whatever that means, without a state is a really stupid. This doesn't even make. That's not even it's a nonsensical conversation to have. And so as a result, yeah, so I agree with you there. So what I define open borders as is a policy held by the U.S. government, or I guess any given government, but I guess in the context of the U.S., I'm a U.S. citizen, I live in the U.S., so I think in terms of the U.S. So I consider open borders as a policy of the state to, oh, sorry, I just got a notification. I gotta shut that off. Okay. It's a policy of the state to not have any state program that prevents people from coming into this country. So you're not paying. Oh, I'm really sorry. I need to close this. Okay, I just got another notification. Okay, so I am against the state having a program paid by taxpayer money to keep people out of this country. That is open borders. So anything such as visas or quotas or just banning people from coming in, that is what I consider closed borders. Anything that prevents people from coming in if they are invited by a citizen is closed borders. So for instance, let me give an example. I have a friend, he lives in Mexico, he's a Mexican citizen, he has no right to be here. I mean, he can get a guest visa, but let's say he couldn't, okay? Now, I want to invite him over to my house. The government then says, sorry, you cannot invite him over to your house because he is not a U.S. citizen and therefore he is not allowed to step foot in the United States. If they do that for any reason, if the federal government is doing that, that is what I consider closed borders. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Does that answer your question? Is that a good definition? You're not muted. Yeah, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay, so just so I understand correctly, anytime the state prevents, so you're saying the guest has to be invited, correct?
Yes. Yes. Well,
okay,
it's a little bit nuanced. We can get into that.
Okay, so I don't see an issue with that, with your definition there from my perspective. I use Hoppy's terms. I use his terms of forced exclusion. Okay, so Hoppy I think Hoppy's he's taken out of context in this often, and a lot of people they're quick to jump on his issues of forced integration, which we can talk about in a second. So what you're saying is, in the closed borders, in Hoppy's view, you're saying that you're against forced exclusion. one party over here invites somebody in.
Uh-huh.
Everybody is agreeing to that. The two parties that matter agree to that transaction, and they move over. But a third party jumps in. The U.S. government comes in and prevents it.
Uh-huh.
I have no issue with that, with your definition of that, and I actually agree that they should not be able to do that in any way whatsoever.
Okay, so I'll mute you again. And okay, so so the other thing you said. Okay, so I just want to address. So you said, okay, so you want to phrase this debate in a different way because you don't like the closed borders, open borders distinction. Instead, you said something along the lines of, given a state does excluding immigrants for entering, or sorry, I typed it wrong. Does excluding immigrants from entering state-owned territory. Okay, so I typed this completely wrong. I'm sorry, but I'll just summarize it. Given that there's a state, is it a violation of the non-aggression principle to ban immigrants from entering state-owned territory? And so I kind of see where you're going with this. You're saying, okay, well, since the state doesn't necessarily legitimately own, at least say a given road, you have a road, it doesn't own it. Is it a violation of the non-aggression principle then to wait? Okay, you need to clarify this question for me a little bit. I'm sorry.
So what I mean is, we're operating this discussion is operating under the purview that a state exists.
Yes, I got that.
That's so we kind of got that first thing out of the way, because Jeff Dice has a great article about how this open borders, closed borders thing is wrong, and he said we favor private borders, right? And he's got a great article on Mises.com that goes into that. It's very short. I recommend people read it because he frames it properly in what the kind of the true libertarian aspect is. We got to abolish the state. Borders take care of themselves after that. So the discussion we're really trying to have is more of a practical one in the world we're living in today. Yes. How should a libertarian, deal with this issue? I think it's very key to get that up front, because I've read parts of Hathaway's book that James Riley recommended read, and I just think too often people are strawmanning people that hold the position that I claim I hold, because they don't understand, and they don't understand that we're framing it this way, as opposed, because they jump back and forth between a world with a state and a world without a state when they're arguing their position. And so I wanted to make sure we were clear that this discussion is kind of operating in that purview of we're given that a state exists.
Okay, so why don't you explain what you mean by does it violate the non-aggression principle?
So, I mean, we as libertarians, I think, and again, I'm sorry if I'm trying to speak for everybody. I just should probably speak for myself. But, we oppose, at the very root, we oppose aggression. Mm-hmm. To understand what aggression is, we have to understand who the proper owner of a resource is. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, given our current system, we have a lot of privately owned land. In your example that you gave, you define it closed borders, and I'm going to say it's forced exclusion. You got one private property owner and an immigrant, and he invites them over. Now, the state should not prevent that in any way whatsoever, right? But what about, and so that goes with all private land. So that solves that issue, right? Anybody from anywhere in the world wants to come to a private piece of property and they're invited, it's fine. So the only dispute we're having, the only dispute we really should be talking about is how do we deal with publicly owned land, parks, roads. How do people access those? How do people legitimately access those resources? So that's what I mean by that. So like, I as a U.S. taxpayer, you as a U.S. taxpayer, we have the best claim to a highway, right? At least we have a partial claim to that highway, right? Because our tax dollars have been expropriated to pay for that highway. The immigrant that come from Guatemala, okay, they're an outsider as in terms of vis-a-vis that road, okay, or vis-a-vis whatever the park is or whatever. They are an outsider. So what legitimately gives them a right to step foot on that property is they would need to be invited by another private property owner. Somebody that's uninvited shows up at the U.S. border at a U.S. road. There's no right for them to step on that. And if they do, and if the state allows them to, they're actually committing trespass because they're now an uninvited guest on an owned resource. And if you go take a step back for a second, how we can come to that is, and Stephan Kinsella has a great article on on it. He calls it a simple, let me see, I got it pulled up here. It's called A Simple Libertarian Argument Against Unrestricted Immigration and Open Borders. And it's a great read. He wrote it over 10 years ago, and it's on Lou Rockwell's archives. You can, I can send you a link to it afterward. And so he uses the example, he says the state really is the best way to describe them is they're an uninvited caretaker of a resource, like a road, right? Like if they exist, they better operate that road like a private owner would operate it and create rules that are good. He used the example of a pool he has in his neighborhood. So he lives in like a suburb of Houston. It's its own municipality. And you've got this pool that's been paid for by their city's tax dollars. And he's like, obviously it'd be better if this thing was private. But if it's going to be publicly owned, the people that are operating that, they can exclude other people from other parts of Houston from using that, or they can charge them more or whatever, because they have a duty to make that resource used to the utility of the actual owners, which are the neighbors of the citizens of his particular community. There's nothing unlibertarian about excluding outsiders from using that resource, even though it's state run and we don't want to operate in that way to begin with. So what I'm saying is that excluding an outsider from a publicly owned resource, whether it be a road or Kinsella's pool, there's no violation of a non-aggression per se. There's no violation of the non-aggression principle in them excluding from that that use. Excluding them from using that resource.
Okay, so let me jump in here. I'm going to mute here. Okay, so there's several things here. First of all, now we're getting, I'm not sure I agree with you in reframing the debate in this way. Because first of all, it's not clear to me that Kinsella or Hoppe's reasoning for saying that the state should act as if it were the legitimate caretaker, blah, 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 and the community pool. I have issues with that. We can get into that whole analogy in a sec. But first of all, I think what we're doing is we're kind of walking this very fine line between a theoretical debate and a practical real world debate. Very, very fine line. And on one hand, we both agree that this is like the stupid question if you have a libertarian society. And that, yeah, obviously only borders are private property borders. I think that's just a dumb thing to even say because it's so obvious. Yeah, of course. Private property borders are the only borders, but we're talking about public property. So instead of thinking about an abstract corner case, if you can possibly find an exception where it may or may not be ethical to prevent someone from stepping on a road or something like that, which I even contest that, but let's just give you that for a second. Let's say that we give you that. Even then, from a practical perspective, it's not like a bunch of people are coming in on these roads just uninvited and they're just only walking on roads and only going on public property and living in government housing and eating like that's not happening. I mean, maybe I'm sure someone's done that, but it's such a small portion of what's happening. I mean, what really happens is there are private property owners in the United States that rent out, that sell food, that sell gasoline, that give rides from whatever they have to drive on the road. If they drive on the road, they're paying the gas tax. Anyone driving on the road is paying the gas tax. They're paying for the road. I mean, all these things that the consumer, first of all, I mean, they do pay some taxes. Immigrants do pay some taxes, and such as sales tax and gas tax. If they're driving, someone's giving them a ride. They're consenting to that, and they're getting invited. They're doing voluntary transactions. I mean, I've personally never heard of a Mexican or whoever coming from Mexico only walking on public roads and only going ever on public property. I mean, they always interact voluntarily with people who live here because people want to do business with them. It's only some people who don't want us to do business with them. So even if you are a caretaker of the United States or something, that doesn't mean that you're by preventing people from coming in, that you're not necessarily acting in the favor of what all the people want you to do. I mean, I want a Mexican to come cut my yard and stuff for really cheap, and you know, it's even from a libertarian's perspective, it's an opportunity to engage in agorism, because if you think about it, paying them below minimum wage, minimum wage is an unethical law. We get a chance to undercut that, and now we can provide services to fellow Americans for cheaper shirts, cheaper berries picked in the fields, all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of benefits. We can get into these practical benefits, but I think since we're not talking about this ideal libertarian world, we're talking about a practical state solution, which is obviously never going to be perfect. I mean, here's the counter to your side. You say, okay, well, we're doing state action, and so in this one little corner case where they're only going on public property, that disproves the whole thing. That's why we should be able to restrict them. Actually, I disagree, because so you've already spent X amount of money on infrastructure and welfare. You've already paid your taxes. You've already done whatever you do to fund the roads and the public infrastructure. Now, the government is going to take an additional expenditure on top of that to pay for the border enforcement. So you may have a little pure case where it's ethical to prevent someone from walking on the road, but given that you're going to now do something about that, you have to then tax people at a higher level for the enforcement of that. And you can say, well, now that's legitimate. Okay, we can get into that discussion. I think it's I think it's probably not legitimate. They're probably going to have they're going to have too much power as an executive agency to search American citizens and do all these things. And I mean, and also there's going to be a lot of waste. So it's going to be taxpayer money going down the drain, aka theft. And not to mention, there's a lot of Americans that don't pay any taxes, and there's a lot of Americans who have contributed or leached just as much as anyone from any other country. And I don't see why we're considering ourselves as Americans to necessarily be in a higher moral standing. So those are that's a slew of arguments. I'll let you address that. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, so the first thing I say is you said it was. I'm trying to quote you. You said it was dumb to even go into the whole the libertarian world, all private property, immigration's handled. I think it's very necessary to mention that, because that is strawmanned so much by people like if you go read Jacob Hornberger on immigration, he does not understand that. So there's prominent libertarians that don't get that. It's why Dice decided to write that article. I think it's very important to bring that up as a preview to this conversation. So I don't think it's a dumb thing to mention.
I'll give you that. I'll just say that whoever doesn't get that is dumb. So
okay, fair enough. But because prominent people are saying it. I mean, I had a Facebook back and forth with Hornberger on that ad nauseum, and he just doesn't get it. And Bionic Mosquitoes goes after him. So it's important to do that. And in Hathaway's book, he doesn't seem to kind of understand how the other side is phrasing it. So I think it's important to bring that up. Anyway. So I think we're getting a little bit away from, I'm not gonna go into all the practical implications of immigration, because I'm going to largely agree with you. Ex ante, anytime somebody is invited over, right, there's a benefit there, right? I mean, I completely agree with that. I'm not going to sit here and say we got to engineer society in some way because some outsiders are coming in. That's not my argument. My argument is purely based on, is it moral to exclude somebody from coming in? And so a private owner can do that. A private owner can say to an immigrant, no, you can't come in. The public aspect, and then in turn, if there's a public aspect of it, then they can. Now I agree with you. What I'm saying is extremely limited in its scope. Like there would be way more changes on the allowing immigrants to come in if what I'm saying the policy that I'm saying is adopted by the state were adopted. It would look a lot like what you're talking about. But it's important to get the principle right that it is not aggression to deny somebody access to a piece of property on its face.
But it also depends on how you're denying it, right? Like the methodology.
Well, okay, exactly. Now let's get to the enforcement side, because so we got a little bit away from them, so I want to bring it back. You were saying all the practical stuff. I'm going to completely agree with you on that. Just back to that question is, does preventing somebody from crossing a border, is that aggression? That's what we have to answer, I think, as libertarians. And so I don't think it necessarily is. And let me give you some examples of what I mean. So okay, so in Hoppe, in Hoppe's book, let me see. He's got a little clip here. The case for free trade and restricted immigration. Again, you can link to that. He lays out what an enforcement mechanism would look like, what it should look like. If a state, again, given a state, what should the What should the enforcement look like? So the state has any kind of border enforcement, like forced deportation of people that are invited, anything that again is forced exclusion is not, it should not be allowed. The state should not. They're engaged in aggression. HAVA completely acknowledges that. But what he says is would be allowable, and what would be reasonable for the state to do if they're in charge of immigration, if they're claiming the right over a monopoly over a service, they had better provide that service. That's what I'm going to get at. I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by that. So he says the only legitimate thing that the state could do is ask for proof of invitation. And when you think about that, it's an extremely, now we'll get to the enforcement in a second, but that's an extremely reasonable thing. I'm here in Dallas, and I go see clients over there. Southwest Airlines has a headquarters here. Man, that thing is, they got armed guards, they got fences around it. And when I go see a client, I've got to drive in, and they have to introduce me, and they have to call the person, verify I have an appointment, and obviously the kind of the implicit contract there is I'm going to go for the appointment and I'm going to leave, right? So that arrangement exists in private property all the time. My office building has a guard, and if you're going to come see it, you got to check in at the front and make sure you have an appointment. I mean, it's a completely reasonable thing to have that in a private. So again, for state-owned property, again, that there's nothing unreasonable, unlibertarian about there being a check for an invitation, right? So that's what border enforcement would look like, in my view, if the state is operating justly. Okay. Now you mentioned like it's funded by taxes, blah blah. Yeah, that's true. But that doesn't make everything they do illegitimate. That makes their revenue service illegitimate. So here's what I mean. If somebody breaks into my house and or let's just use an example. Somebody breaks into a house and they murder somebody, right? Well, I mean, what is your recourse? You've been stolen from to pay taxes for the police, right? If I call the police, they better go arrest the guy. They better prosecute him. They better put him in prison. All those things are just actions. They use force to arrest the guy. And this is where Hathaway goes off, is he talks about forced, he's like, oh, well, because you're kind of going there is, well, now you got to use force to enforce your border restrictions, whatever they happen to be. Well, force itself is not unjustified, or is not necessarily aggression if it's justified use of force. Using it against a murderer, using it, putting him in prison, using it against a rapist, it's perfectly legitimate for the police, the state-run police, to take those actions against people that are actually committing aggression. Now, when the police turn that action on people using drugs or doing that kind of thing, now the police are the aggressors. So when we're living in the practical world, we have to see not just, oh my God, the entire state is illegitimate, which we would say that it is, but we have to look at every single action that they do, and is every individual action justified? Is that action aggression, or is it not? Because otherwise we go down a slippery slope, and then we end up, all having to live in our own houses, not being able to interact with anybody, because we're all kind of through proxy by 2 or 3 steps in the future, we're all committing aggression. So, I don't think libertarian is a suicide pact at all. So, so that's what I mean by that. I think that, so I use the police thing all the time and be like, to try to combat that argument, right? It's legitimate for police to make certain actions, for prosecuting attorneys to put actual, but we know the better way to do this would not have no state at all. We'd have a lot more justice that way. But as long as they're going to exist and they're going to claim monopoly, they better provide the service they say they're going to provide in a just way. And so I'm going to look at every individual action the state does to see if there's aggression there or not. And I'm going to oppose it when there is aggression, and I'm going to be against it. And I'm going to be in favor of it if there's no aggression. That's kind of how I look at this thing when I'm trying to go about my everyday life, right? And I see immigration through that exact lens.
Okay, I'm gonna unmute you. So, yeah, and I completely agree with the police thing. I've made that point myself many times. Yeah, it's true. If they claim a monopoly, they should. Well, that's not necessarily true, there, right? But I get what you're saying. In the case of the police, it seems like that's probably true, and I think I think it is true in the case of the police. I do not think that's true in the case of Border Patrol, because you have yet to prove that we should even have Border Patrol in the first place. I mean, you could have, so like bullying, for example, is not against the non-aggression principle. I could say, "Ha, you're a loser. Ha, kill yourself," right? That's not against the non-aggression principle. Yet,
Can I jump in real quick? So I did address that. I don't. Most actions of border patrols take would be illegitimate. Most of them, in almost everything that they do, right? They're seizing drugs, they're doing all that stuff. But what is legitimate is that they could check for invitation at the, that would be, it would, what I'm saying, the state illegitimate function would be like a toll booth operator, right? That would be, and when you walk in, if like, think about how private works, there might be a security guard there, right? But in the market, you have to talk to somebody that's going to check your ID, and usually they're not going to put the person with a gun talking to you. They're going to have some nice customer service person that's really, really polite when you. So that's what the that would be a legitimate function of a border patrol, would be checking for invitation, and that's the only thing they could do. Now, you would probably have people that would need to be like a police that would back them up, right? If somebody that was uninvited that was going to trespass on the property, it'd be justified to forcibly remove them. That's where, but they couldn't do that to somebody that was they shouldn't be able to do that to somebody that would be invited. So anyway, that I tried to address that, I just didn't expound on it. So sorry.
Okay, no, yeah. And so see, I got that actually, but my criticism is that you haven't actually proven that, and you haven't actually established that, and you're kind of, not you, but everyone with the 2 points, kind of just making this stuff up. And what I mean by that is that, how do you know that if there was a private covenant community or something, how they would do it? I mean, they could actually just say nobody can come in, even if you're invited. We all have a pact where we agree, and we have these agreements. You could do things in a wide array of different ways, and you could use large amounts of force or less large amounts of force if you have an agreement in a private community. You don't have to let someone who's invited come in if that's not what the community is going to say. Or there could be communities where they have a road where they say everyone can come in. And there's a lot of different arrangements that you can have. And I don't know why you think that invitations is, I mean, yes, theoretically, there could be a private community that would require invitations to come in. Right? That's possible, but why are you saying that that's the minimum? Doesn't that then go and justify all kinds of different things? Because yes, there could be a community that has some other criteria and has some other way of doing things. I mean, that's a very mild, benign way of putting it. It makes a lot of sense. I think from a policy perspective, that's a really great idea. But from like an ethical perspective, you don't have to stop there. You could do all kinds of stuff. I mean, you could say if you step foot onto the United States on a road, we could shoot you. By that logic, I mean, you could in a covenant. Yes, you could. If you have a covenant, a private community, and someone trespasses on the private community, you could shoot them. That's self-defense, right? I mean, you could say, okay, it's not proportional. Okay, fine, but there's probably some crazy stuff you could fit in there. And my point, and by the way, I'm a huge fan of private communities. I'm a huge fan of them. I don't think that they're going to end up like that. But what I'm saying is that you are just kind of projecting what you think is a nice policy and saying that that is what lines up perfectly with the non-aggression principle. And but then you're saying that it's kind of that the reason why you're doing this is kind of like a practical, you have a practical concern because the government is supposed to be a caretaker of the public property, and therefore they need to do it in a way that it would replicate how it would be, which you don't know how it would be, but you're saying that it should be like something like this, like what you're proposing. And what I'm saying is that, first of all, you don't know that, you haven't proven that, and second of all, I mean, you can't say we've already paid for, like what you were saying is, we've already paid for the police, and they have a monopoly, so now we should at least get their services. I agree that because we want their services, but I'm saying we shouldn't, since now now you've reduced this to, well, what do we want? This is like based on whether we want this or not. I say we don't want Border Patrol. I say that there's, as I had said in the beginning, there's so few people who are only coming on private property. We can just imply that if someone's coming to the United States, they're getting, I mean, this isn't like a small town where there's so many hooligans messing things around. This is a whole country. I mean, there's going to be someone who's going to rent to them, who's going to sell to them, who's going to do commerce with them. I've never heard of that not happening. That always happens. So let's just make the assumption, for practicality's sake, because we don't know what would actually happen if this was a private community. We have no idea. So we can't really go to that argument unless we're going to make up something. But so since we don't know, we might as well just do the thing that is in line with what you're saying, assume that everyone has invitations, because they most likely do. And if they don't have one, they're going to get one really soon. I mean, what if there was a private community and then someone walked up to the gates and said, "Hey, does anyone want to let me in?" And someone said yes, right? That would be fine. That's the same thing. Yeah, they may not actually have an invitation from someone coming before they cross the border, but once they get over, they're always greeted with voluntary interactions, commerce, renting out stuff, giving rides, all that kind of stuff. I'm gonna let you talk. You can unmute yourself.
So, okay, so this goes back to, okay, I think I understand your objection. And so I think one of the, what I talked about with the private pool or the government-run pool, I think goes to proving that having some restrictions creates better utility, right? You don't want to overrun public pool. It'd be better to have some restrictions there. If everybody from the outside of Houston could come use their pool, it'd be completely useless. So having some rules that govern access make that better. Same with driving on the highway. Like, it makes sense to have some rules to the road, right? So we just apply that same logic to immigration. But now this gets to the forced exclusion and forced integration. I don't think we're gonna have any issues on the forced exclusion thing. I mean, we're completely in line on that. Now, the reason it comes to you need to have an invitation is because, okay, private or public property is communally owned, obviously forcefully, but it is communally owned, right? So if and why this is not just practical, but leads to aggression. Okay, if I have to associate with somebody that I didn't want to associate with, aggression's been forced upon me. If I have to serve somebody at my restaurant that I didn't want to serve, there's the third parties came in and told me who I have to associate with, right? So if the state, you're accusing me of, is the state is restricting things and being aggressive toward people that want in, I think is what you're saying. But I'm saying that if you let somebody in without an invitation, if that land is communally owned, right, there's a chance that I'm going to say actually the chances are greater that just one person that has a right to use that property as one of the people that have been expropriated to pay for it or be a part of it is not going to want to associate with that person. Okay, so that's why I say that makes the most sense, because you're going all the way to the forced exclusion side, and I'm trying to balance forced exclusion and forced integration. I don't want people coming in that don't want to associate with an for whatever reason they have. It doesn't really matter. They could be racist or they could be trying to protect their job. It doesn't matter their reason that they don't want them there. The reason is they have a better claim to that publicly owned land than the outsider does that doesn't have an invitation. And again,
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, okay, you're muted, by the way, so just make sure to unmute yourself before you talk. Okay, right, what you just said. So what if I invite my friend from Mexico to come to my house and he uses the road to come here and my neighbor doesn't want him to come? You said that you don't, like, if you're forcing someone to, right? You're forcing someone to come in and they don't have permission of everybody, and obviously you can't get everyone's permission. There should be some sort of process. Can you explain how that dynamic works? At what point is it okay to not have everyone's consensus, and what point it is, and just any nuances around that?
No. If he's got an invitation from you, he's on the publicly owned property with permission. Because so he has a right to be there.
Okay. And just really
quick, he's not trespassing. Let's just say that he's not committing trespass. That's the only thing that matters. In my view, I'm looking at this, he's not committing trespass. Okay,
so muting again. So therefore, what do you say to my argument from before that everyone has an invitation already? It's just maybe not an explicit written invitation beforehand. They come in and then they're greeted with open arms by people willing to sell them things and wanting them to rent their stuff and pay for their things and do labor for them. I mean, I'd be ecstatic to get a discount on my car wash or anything like that. So just why are your type of invitations valid and not my type of invitations?
Well, okay, so if somebody let's just take some random part of the world, somebody just, from sub-Saharan Africa just, happens to wander over and they show up at the border and they don't know a single soul, right? I mean, then yeah, they don't have a legitimate reason to step. They don't have a legitimate claim to step foot on the land. They don't have an explicit or implicit invitation. Now they don't. You can't just make it up and say, well, maybe they'll get one later.
Hold on.
Wait. Okay, but listen. Just let me finish. Okay. So you would have to think, like, if that person is in demand in some way, then they're going to have an invitation. So you're kind of begging the question of, do they have an invitation or not, by just claiming they always have one.
Well, in a practical sense, let me mute this really quick. In a practical sense, though, everyone always does come and they always do engage in voluntary transactions. I've never heard if no one is going to rent anything to you, if no one's going to sell anything to you, if no one's going to buy anything from you, if no one's going to hire you, you go back. There's nothing for you to. I mean, I don't know of anyone who just comes and only uses public property ever. At some point, they're going to be invited by someone by engaging in a voluntary transaction, because someone will be happy to sell them a tomato or whatever. And yes, you're saying that they don't necessarily have a claim when they're stepping in. That's true. But I could imagine a covenant community that's private property where they have the policy, well, anyone can come in here and we can kick them out later, but at least for now, like, they can come in and see if someone wants to do commerce with them. I mean, you can imagine that policy.
Yeah, no, the covenant community thing is different, because all those people they all contract on what those rules are happen to be.
Right.
That hasn't occurred in the situation of the United States exists today. So you can't just assume the most beneficial thing toward the immigrant. You have to assume that the most likely thing is that somebody's going to object to that person.
But someone already can object.
What?
Somebody, you're muted. Somebody can object already. If I invite my friend, everyone else doesn't want them to come in, you say that they can still come. So it doesn't matter. I mean, someone at some point is going to agree. So why don't you just forget the formality of getting this formal letter? It's very arbitrary, and just let them come in and use public property. I mean, they're not. I see this as very, very arbitrary rule that you're placing.
Yeah. Well, okay. No, and again, I'm not saying there has to be a formal invitation. It can be implicit, right? I mean, that's a legitimate thing. Like, I don't have a formal invitation when I go to different office buildings around town. Like, we don't need to have that. Doesn't need to exist.
Exactly.
But if again, just use the office building example, right? I mean, you just some guy wanders off the street and he just starts wandering. He's not invited. He doesn't have a right to be in the office building, right? I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable thing that exists on the market, and it's kind of explicit that that's the case. Where if you go into buildings or you go somewhere, like, you need to have some sort of permission to be there, right? And that's ultimately what I'm getting at, is that anybody that comes to publicly owned land, they need to have permission to be there. That's how border crossings work on the market. They need to look like that. And so again, I know I'm talking very thin, but it's the principle of the matter that's key here, because and let me flip this a little bit. If you take the open borders argument to its logical conclusion, right? If I mean think about this, like, if if a invading army showed up on the highway, right? I mean, they don't have an invitation to be there, but they can walk. But what's preventing them from why can we stop them? Because we know that they're intent on harm, right? What if we just take away the guns and we just say all these people from a place, and again, I'm going to throw some assumption there. I mean I oppose these people, but I'm saying come from a very illiberal place, right? And all of a sudden thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands start showing up at the border, I'm just saying hypothetically, right? You take it to its logical conclusion. At what point can we say no? What point can we shut the door and say, hey, we're gonna need you to show permission now, right? So I feel like, again, because we're insulated, we don't have to necessarily deal with that, but that's the logical conclusion of being open borders and not being able to check for an invitation, is that if people from all over the world come over, we would have to, according to your logic, we'd have to let them all in. Now I don't foresee that happening, because of just real world thing, but like Europe has to deal with that. Like they have them all showing up at their door right now, and they need to be, and I believe they'd be proper in saying you need to have permission to come into our countries, to come into our publicly owned property. Like that's where this thing is really playing out, where our principle would really, or the principle that I'm espousing, that I'm kind of developing from what Hoppe did, is really important.
Okay, so it has been an hour. I mean, I can go as long as you want to go, so just let me know if you feel caught up and you need to get somewhere. So I'll just keep going until you tell me otherwise. So yeah, no, okay. So the Army, look, I'm not the one who's making a moral absolutist claim about open borders. I'm not. I never said that there is anything you can discern from property rights one way or the other. Okay, and so first of all, I'm just trying to figure out the best way to say this. So you are saying that because because roads are taken by the government, they are now going to be the caretaker of these roads, and they should act as a private community would act in that case, right? That's what you're saying. Now, I am not saying that I am not bringing in a moral claim here. I am simply saying that I disagree with your statement about. I'm simply saying that I disagree with your moral justification for that, and I don't think it's on solid ground. And yeah, if there's a private army, sorry, not a private army, an army that's walking on our country, yeah, I do think that we could do something I think that would be, that kind of falls, in my opinion, under a different category. And maybe you're not like comfortable with that, with me categorizing things in such an arbitrary way where I say, well, this is an army and this is not an army, but I do. And I think that, and I'm not saying it on your grounds, I'm saying it on practical grounds, because since we have the state, as we were saying, we need a practical policy, and you're the one making trying to make a consistent moral argument, and I'm not trying to make a consistent moral argument. I think no moral argument can be made one way or the other. I think it is arbitrary. When I'm saying, oh well, your rules are very arbitrary, I'm not saying that as an insult. I'm saying that as the fact that I just don't believe it's possible to have moral reasoning, like have some principled case for some government action in this case. So you can't really trap me in the same way that I can trap you, because I'm not making the same type of argument that you're making. I'm only disagreeing with your argument, and then I'm saying, look, all we can have is a practical arrangement, so let's do what's most practical. And what's most practical, again, is that, yes, I mean, I don't know how we can really even straighten this out at this point, because I'm saying that people do have, like, nobody is coming here and just using the welfare. At some point, someone is going to be invited, and that is a completely legitimate thing. Go ahead.
No, we managed to go an hour without anybody saying welfare. I was hoping we were going to make it the whole time, but
okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, I'm just kidding. I don't like to bring that up because. Right. Anyway, sorry. You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's fine. Let me just move this really quick. So, yeah, no, I mean, you can call roads welfare to some extent. I hear that criticism that they come and they're using resources, and that's kind of like they're coming and stealing. And I'm glad that that's the argument you just made too. What's the difference between a private, or not? I keep saying a private army. I don't know why I keep saying that. What's the difference between an army walking down the road and attacking and doing whatever. I guess once they attack, it's okay to respond, but like they could position themselves to kill us, and then they could all attack at once and kill us all, and we couldn't defend because they were just immigrants. I get what you're saying, but I just reject that. I'm not. Yeah, I guess there's no difference. But I mean, you could say there's intent for harm, and you could say that they're getting welfare and intent for harm. I'm saying that there's no way you can morally. I mean, so even in that case, right? Even in that case, you'd have to then prove that there's intent for harm, and it gets more complicated. But let's just.
But you're hitting on it. You're hitting on a very important thing. So let's reduce it to one. So let's say you have an immigrant from a place, not to give Trump any credence, but what if we have a known rapist convicted of rape in Mexico and shows up at the border uninvited, right? What do we do?
Nothing.
Are we justified in? Is the U.S. government justified in excluding him and stopping him from crossing the border?
No,
they're not. They would be violating his rights to be committing aggression against him if they stopped him from entering the United States.
Correct.
Okay. See, that's why I think I think that's impractical. I think you're making a practical argument, and you're trying to be consistent in a way that now all of a sudden you're having to justify something you don't have to justify. Like, it's okay to, if somebody has committed aggression in the past, if somebody has committed crimes, you don't have to let them into your community. And the problem with the U.S. is just too big of a community, right? But the U.S. government does not have to do that. And the reason I'm saying they're allowed to, I'm getting to a principle behind that. And it's the same reason why, again, I know we're kind of going in circles, but I think that's a problem, that you have to say yes to that.
Muting 1 sec. Okay. So no, I don't think I have to say yes to that. Now, and that was a very, very, very general question, and it's very vague. And so, but in general, my answer is yes. I guess I could think of a reason why the answer would be no, but I'm going to qualify that by, I don't think that Border Patrol is the one who should be saying no. Right? So if there's someone who's going, like say Bob is going to rape Sally, so Bob walks over to close to Sally's house, and the police know, he's going to rape her, right? We already agreed that police is a legitimate force, assuming we have the state, right? So I think the police are legitimate in stopping someone from going to rape someone else, right? Now, I also think, I guess it's debatable, but like if there's a criminal who's convicted of a violent crime in Mexico, and the Mexican authorities want them, and then the U.S. can go and they can even debatably prosecute the person for the crime they did in Mexico, or send them back to the authorities in Mexico. That's also fair. I don't know how I think about that. I have to think about it more, but I think there's a case to be made there. But if there's just a guy who did rape someone at one point, and I mean, I'm just coming up with a hypothetical. Let's say they were very young, it was a foolish mistake, and then they served time in prison or whatever the punishment was, they paid restitution, whatever. I don't know where they come from. There's some way of dealing with it. They've paid their dues. Now they're way older. They're way more mature. Yeah, they're known rapists. I'm saying it this way simply because it's a clear example of why I don't think there's anything wrong. But I think even, yes, if someone was a recent rapist, I think if there's no reason to believe that they're going to rape someone, and they're not wanted, and they've already done to serve their time for their crime that they've already committed, then yes, I think we can let them in. Now, if they are going to rape someone else, or they have gone unpunished, I think that's what our police are for. And we agreed police are okay under this specific circumstance. And therefore, I think, yeah, then the police should stop them on the grounds that they're a criminal, not on the grounds that they're immigrating.
Yeah. So again, it gets to the reason I would oppose that would be is because it would create forced, without invitation. Like, I completely agree with you. If someone's rehabilitated, they did their time, and we don't have to send them back because they're still at large. Then if somebody in the United States wanted to invite that person in, right, then they would they would be able to do that. I mean, I think there'd be some issues there with him having to do commerce with other people that may not be okay with his past, right? But the moment you let him into the United States onto the public property, you're creating forced integration. You're making people associate with him who don't want to associate with him. and that's where the aggression is occurring.
They already do. Under what you're proposing, they also are forced to associate with him if they don't want to. Because if one person invites him, then they still have to associate with him. And you say that that's legitimate, but it's extremely arbitrary. I mean, he's going to do business with someone, so they're going to invite him. You can unmute. Sorry.
No, it's him. Again, it's very specific. It's him being on the public property that's the issue, right? Not if he goes, not if he has an invitation. He can go if he has an invitation. But again, we're kind of in that. You're going to have to assume that there's no, the state has really bad non-discrimination laws and stuff like that that might prevent him from doing that. So obviously we'd want to abolish those, right? But so that people would be free to disassociate with him if they wanted to. But the fact that you're allowing him on a public U.S. highway is you're forcing other drivers to be you're forcing other people on that highway to associate with him. That is aggression. It's aggression to force people to associate with people they don't want to. So that's why I oppose it. Now, people could come in and say, there's some practical reasons why we wouldn't let him in, but we should just assume everybody's fine unless we have evidence or whatever. But what I'm getting to is I'm getting to a principled reason why you can disassociate him besides he's a rapist, right? Because I think that's arbitrary. I think what I've come up with, I don't feel like it's arbitrary at all. I think it's rooted in the same thing about the police, the same thing about the office buildings. It's rooted in consistency in that regard. So anyway, I don't know if I got anything else to really hit on, like, and I feel like.
Oh, sorry, I muted you on accident. I'm sorry.
There.
Go on. You feel?
I mean, I feel like I've been defending my side of this a lot. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to more of what you mean by, or more of what you foresee this looking like, or anything we've kind of left off, or anything like that. So
okay, yeah. Let me summarize kind of what my point is, and then I'll have I have a kind of question for you. So I think what our disagreement comes down to is we agree with, if there's a private property society, it's like, what even is immigration? It's not even really a term that we even need to deal with. You just let people on your property if you want to be on your property, otherwise you don't. That's obvious. Okay, we're setting that aside. Well, that is theoretical, but we have a state, and we agree that if the state has a monopoly on a service, and the private sector would otherwise provide that service, the state should at least, I mean, obviously, what the state should do is abolish itself. But since it's not going to do that, let's at least provide the service that it's going to do. And you're right. The state would not allow a private community to hire someone to kick people out. It's a very unfortunate law. It doesn't allow. You can't do like city level immigration. That is unfortunate. However, we disagree on simply one basic thing, and this is really, we're just not seeing eye to eye on it. And the thing that we're disagreeing on is that you are saying that they need an invitation to come on to U.S. soil, and I am saying that they don't. And the distinction here is simply that I'm not sure I understand where you get this invitation idea, other than it sounds good and it seems like it goes with, like it would be the case under a private property society. But you want an explicit explicit invitation. I say that we can just assume that everyone is invited, because at some point someone's going to consent to doing a transaction with them. And then if you would ask them then, like in the past, like a store owner, say they buy something from a store owner, you could then ask that store owner in the future, say you said, hey, I know that, or you go back in time and you could say, hey, there's going to be a guy who's going to come and want to buy something from your store. Would you allow him to do so? And he'd say yes. And then he's going to come in, and then it's like a time traveling scenario, but you can see how the store owner would consent had he known that the person was going to come buy something from the store. And I think that's the case for every single person. I mean, I think if they're renting someone, or if they're renting a house from someone, if they're taking some sort of buying some sort of service or some sort of goods, I think it's safe to, or even having any friend that's a citizen in the whole country, I think it's safe to assume that had you asked that person, knowing what they would know in the future, they would have given the invitation. So that is a de facto invitation. And I just don't see why it has to be an explicit invitation up front. You said there could be an implicit invitation. If that's the case, then that would be interesting to see what the actual policy is there, because that sounds a lot like what I'm saying. I guess the one difference would be if they got their invitation rescinded, then that would make some complications, but I don't really know how that would work, because you don't know who is the one who's giving the implied invitation. But I just think as a policy, as a general rule, immigrants are coming in and they're using private property. They're not only using public property. At some point, they're engaging in commerce, and by doing that, I think that is implied consent, because you consented to do commerce. Therefore, just like you therefore are demonstrating your preference that you want that good more than this good by trading, you are, by interacting with a person, you're then therefore consenting to them being there, and you're inviting them, so to speak. And that is my stance on it. I think it's arbitrary to say either way. And I come at this issue just from a practical perspective. I think immigrants are good for the economy. I think just on a practical ground, most of them are good people, and I want them to come here. I mean, I could just say I invite everyone preemptively, but I know that's like a not fair thing to say. But also, I want them here because it's going to bring down my tax liability, because what happens is they come here, they get on welfare, they drive up with the debt, but then they have children. The children pay more in taxes than the debt was there. Then there was debt, and now the amount of debt per capita decreases because the population increased without having a proportional increase in welfare expenditures. So that's just a simple math. It also boosts the economy, and it's also, I think it's just it is really beneficial for the people who are in these third world countries to come to America, where there's higher amounts of capital and they're able to be more productive and they can send money back to their families and do all these things. I think it's good for everyone. It's a win-win situation, and I don't see a principled objection. I guess my one question to you would be, I mean, you have this very interesting view that I don't fully understand how you get to it, but where you have to have an invitation, what would you're clearly not in favor of current U.S. policy or a Trumpian U.S. policy. What type of policy are you in favor of? I'd probably prefer it to whatever we have now, but so why don't you can give your closing statement and then answer that question.
Well, I just have one question for you, and then I'll go into that. Do you think there's a right to immigrate? You think people have a right to come into the United States?
Mm-mm.
Okay. All right. Perfect.
I think that you have a right. You do have a right to invite someone onto your property, but I don't think that you have a right to be on public property. I think it's indeterminate. There's no right. It's not a right, and no one has a right to exclude you. You don't have a right to. It's a moral hazard. It's not a legitimate property. You can't know what the actual use is supposed to be, so you can make a moral judgment based on it.
Okay, but then why can you stop the army then?
For practical purposes.
Okay, so there's room for practical, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you determine what's practical, and who determines that?
Well, okay. I think that there is a good case to be made for a practical case. There's a good practical case for immigration, as I kind of was alluding to in my closing statement, which we can get into too. I have time if you want. I think there's a practical case for immigration. I think on the grounds that immigration should be discussed, I think it should be discussed in a practical way. And I don't think that, what I'm saying is I don't think there's a moral ground in favor of immigration control. And I think that we have to, since the state really muddies the waters in terms of morality, and I guess even like police, for instance, we did agree that it's okay to provide police, but I guess I maybe now have explained my viewpoint. I think for practical reasons, it's okay for the police to operate. I still don't think that they're legitimate. I don't think that, And I don't think that Border Patrol is legitimate either, but I think it's also impractical. Therefore, I don't want it. And I think fighting an army is practical, but it's not. You're not morally justified in doing a military action of any sort.
Right. Well, the border patrol could hypothetically, in my scenario, they could hypothetically be legitimate because of if they were if they were only expelling people that were uninvited or that lost their invitation or committed aggression when they came. Right. Their invitation can be implicitly rescinded if you come to the United States as a guest and then you rob a bank or you rape somebody or you kill somebody. Right. You could. In my view, you could be legitimately expelled from the society. I think that's a legitimate thing. So if you were to, I think you could legitimately be deported as well. So I think before I go into my closing, I just think there is a legitimate function of Border Patrol, but it'd be much different than what it is today, right? And you could probably merge it with any number of law enforcement agencies.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. So
okay. Go on.
Just summarize. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So. I think this has been a productive conversation because, and I want to thank you for not strawmanning what I'm saying, because that happens a lot in this discussion, right? When somebody immediately jumps and accuses, well, you just want the state to use violence against people. I don't think you accused me of that. You asked me about it to explain it, but you didn't accuse me. So I think it's been a productive conversation from that, in that we've engaged each other in kind of the arguments that we're making and tried our best to understand exactly what the other person is saying. So from that, I think this has been productive, and I hope somebody listening understands it. So again, to summarize where I come from, I think that when you think about purely private property, moving across borders occurs voluntarily. It occurs consensually between two people. I think the state does claim ownership of property, just like they claim monopoly over certain services. And if they're going to do that, they need to provide that service in the most just way possible and try to mirror whatever the market would look like. And I know that's not going to happen, but we can praise it when they do something legitimate, and we can oppose it when they commit aggression. So what I'm trying to do by talking about immigration in this way is I'm coming at it. I'm trying to avoid, because with a state we are going to have forced exclusion. They are going to exclude people that are supposed to be here, and they are going to force people to associate with other people. That's what is happening right now. People are being forcibly excluded, but they're also being forced to associate with people they wouldn't otherwise want to associate with. So what the policy we're trying to get to is what minimizes both of those things to the best degree possible. And the way that minimizes that, and because those are both forms of aggression, and as libertarians we're trying to minimize aggression, and that's where I'm coming from, is what is again, there's a practical element to this, no doubt, but what is the policy that minimizes those two things? And the policy that does that is only allowing invited people to come on to having a proof of invitation in some form or fashion, right? And all I meant when I said implicit was like, if I offered an immigrant a job, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm implicitly giving him permission to come here, right? I mean, that's all I mean by that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I don't think you can do what you're trying to do and say that basically everybody has permission, because in the future they might do business. They might do business with somebody. Right? If you just take this to its conclusion on how the market works, if this policy were adopted by the state, right, where they accepted invitations, because right now everybody has to go through the state to get their invitation, right? They got to get invited through the state. Well, we're eliminating that. Now a market would come up for how you match people that want to come in with people that don't, right, or the people that want them to come in, right? So you wouldn't have this huge problem. But the important thing here I'm trying to get at is the principle, because I think the open borders people are they are open to massive immigration coming in by using the arguments that they do. They're opening themselves to the reductio, right? That if you reductio ad absurdum, is like, well, if one person can come and step in uninvited, right, or have some implicit invitation, well, Can 100,000? Can 1,000,000? Can 2,000,000? How many can come in before it's okay to stop them, or is it never okay? And I would say that we have to draw a line somewhere. There's a limit, and my line to make it as consistent and to minimize aggression is to have an invitation to come in. That would be the thing that would minimize those two things, and that's how I'm coming at this thing.
Great. Well, let me get this really quick. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. This was an awesome conversation. I guess, oh wow, we went like I guess a little over an hour. So that's awesome. I think it's going to be great. I hope everyone who watched this enjoys. And by the way, if you're still watching, if you're watching at this point, remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel and you know, share this video and see if let's have some more discussion. And I want to do another one of these. So in the Tom Woods group, if you're in the Tom Woods group, let's organize another one and let's have more discussion, maybe on immigration or on something else. Do you have anything else you want to say, Andrew?
Well, how are you possibly going to find anything and libertarians disagree on to have a discussion on?
It's very difficult. I don't know if it will.
No, that's it. I really appreciate you getting this together. I think this is a good forum to kind of have this discussion, because it's been gone at ad nauseum in the group and in libertarian circles for a while. So
yeah, I think we could even do another immigration one just simply because there's like such a dense issue.
Yeah, no, it is, and we could try to get at some more of the specifics of these individual points. But no, I think it's been good.
Cool. Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Take care, Liam.
Bye.